Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly edition of the Wrap. I'm Travis Spain, state government reporter for WRAL.
And I'm Brian Anderson, also a state government reporter for WRAL.
Yeah, and this could have been a slow week. Turned out not to be a slow week. The big news this week, I think, bigger than anything else, was that Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, a Republican who has railed against abortion rights, we learned that he, in fact, paid for an abortion in 1989. He would have been about 21 years old there. It was revealed in a Facebook comment, a couple of Facebook comments actually, years ago, but just didn't come to light until this week. Brian, you wrote a little bit about that this week. Tell us a bit more about this.
Yeah, so I talked with Mark Robinson, and he said this is something he's been wanting to speak to for years. And he posted publicly a Facebook comment in August and September of 2012 that he had paid for an abortion for, as he puts it, an unborn child of his back in 1989. And then after our reporting, he had put out a video statement that really spoke to it. And he had his wife, Yolanda, sitting next to him. She didn't speak during the video, but Robinson had explained that they were not married yet. They had not had kids yet. And they made what he considered to be a very tough decision, and now looks back on it with a mistake. Says, this has fueled my belief that we need to protect the unborn children, and this has reaffirmed his views on abortion. But critics say it's inconsistent and you shouldn't be able to force your views onto me.
Yeah, and abortion is such a difficult topic because it is such a difficult decision for the people who have to make it. And there's got to be a pain to it that I don't want to gloss over here, but we are going to kind of talk about the politics of it here. I think both things can be true. One, that this is hypocritical, that he is attempting to pull up the ladder after himself by opposing abortion rights for others when he and his wife took advantage of them. But what can also be true is, kind of a road to Damascus conversion here, where someone with experience with something is now against it. I mean, it was, how long ago was 1989? Were you alive in 1989?
I was alive in 1995, and only barely because that was December. So that was,
so there you go.
It was 33 years ago, Robinson's comment, and I confess I'm the Madison Cawthorn and Bo Hines age of 26.
So, obviously we've got to leave room for people to change, but like I said, both things can be true, right? To be so outspoken against abortion rights for others when you yourself have done this, I certainly can see why people are angry about that. On the Republican side, I haven't seen a ton of response. I saw Dan Bishop tweet his support for Robinson. There have been a few others like that. I don't think this is going to particularly hurt him politically, but there are probably other takes on that.
Yeah, and we had reached out to the North Carolina Republican Party, and they said, we declined to comment. We consider it a personal matter for Robinson. And we heard from Dan Bishop say, it's refreshing that someone has been this open and transparent, albeit we had an election in 2020. Robinson could have talked about this on the campaign trail and didn't, but it was a public Facebook comment in 2012 that anyone presumably could have seen and had access to. But I'm left with this thinking, people are complicated. Robinson, it could be in some ways a paradox in some ways. And I think this really points at just how messy and personal this issue is for folks, and how, it's very complicated that your personal life and your public life can seemingly be different.
Yeah, you opened yourself up to being called a hypocrite when your personal and public lives are. I mean, if you're saying that people can't do something, but you yourself have done it, that is, particularly when he is so vociferous about it. But like I said, I don't see this really changing the political math much, if at all. Maybe there are some conversations going on in the background, groups that really push back against abortion, who will not want to support him further. But I kind of doubt that. I suspect this is more of a there's no zealot like the converted. has always been a saying, and I think that's probably the road that we're looking at here. I do want to mention briefly what a vetting fail this was. I covered this election in 2020. I didn't know this. I will kind of give myself and other reporters on the political beat in 2020 a pass that we were also trying to cover a pandemic in an election. That was not easy. But, Yvonne Hawley's lieutenant governor campaign, Democrats in general, to fail to have noticed that he publicly revealed that he had paid for an abortion. I suspect, particularly if timed well, that information would have been had some impact on the lieutenant governor's race in 2020. It's astounding in this day and age that it didn't come out.
Well, I will say he had a very crowded primary field as well. So it's not just the Democrats that could have found this information. There's several Republicans he was running against, and he really pummeled all of them in that primary race. And 2018 was sort of his claim to fame with the gun rights speech in Greensboro. And since then, he's had this meteoric rise in conservative politics. And I would point out the North Carolina Faith and Freedom Coalition did sort of express some support for Robinson in his remarks after his video was published. And they're a group that is conservative, religious, works to elect conservative, religious Republicans. But I will also caveat that this was not a Facebook post. This was a Facebook comment. And I generally think maybe some people would look for Facebook posts, but not dig through every single comment. And I don't know how there's enough time in the world to sift through everything Mark Robinson said on social media. That would be quite the endeavor.
That is the truth. That is the truth. Moving on, Leandro back in the news. The long-running court case seeking to increase education funding for K through 12 schools in North Carolina. We got a new judge who's going to be overseeing it. Michael Robinson, business court judge and a Republican, replaces David Lee, who is a Democrat. That was Supreme Court Chief Justice Paul Newby's decision. A number of people noting, of course, that Newby is a Republican. Republicans don't really like what Judge Lee did with this case, and now there's a new judge on it. This new judge will take 30 days, I believe, to assess Lee's ordering $1.7 billion in increased education spending, and kind of comparing that to the state budget the past a few months ago, and how much of a bite out of that 1.7 billion the state budget took. And then there'll be a hearing April 13th is where this is going. And then eventually back up, I think, to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not the court can or will order the state legislature to spend more money on education in North Carolina.
And take a moment to pause that this judge said he found out about it just like everybody else found out about it. And it came from Chief Justice Paul Newby, who's a Republican Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. So there might be some partisan politics or just politics at play. And this sort of speaks to the growing partisanship, or at least perception of partisanship, that's really been here in North Carolina, especially the past 12 months with redistricting and now Leandro. The notion of an independent judiciary is certainly drawing some eyebrows from both sides who don't see it that way.
Yeah, when case after case has such big political ramifications, it's hard to get away from the politics of the court. You wrote this week also about, you kind of broke down the Senate Republican primary. Tell us a little bit about that and what you found and what's kind of new and interesting there.
I liken it to the movie Burn After Reading, where it's just a big, giant mess, the Republican primary here for U.S. Senate is. And I think you have four leading candidates: Marjorie K. Eastman, a former Army combat veteran she is. And then you have former North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory, who's 1 for 3 in statewide elections. He won in 2012. He lost in 2008 and 2016 to Bev Perdue and Roy Cooper. And then you also have the Trump wing, which is former Congressman Mark Walker, and you also have current U.S. Congressman Ted Budd. Ted Budd has the Trump endorsement, Walker does not. And in the process of speaking with these four candidates, we learned that Budd and Walker don't seem to get along too well. According to Walker, he said that he met with Bud in December of 2019 in the Longworth building in DC. And he came away from that meeting thinking they had an understanding that, Bud would stay in the US House and Walker would make the leap to US Senate. Bud said he's shocked and surprised to have heard that. He agrees that they did discuss the possibility of avoiding a contested congressional primary election, but he did not come away from that meeting with any sort of understanding being reached, and said he took, quote, exquisite notes of that conversation, which I asked for, but he wouldn't provide because he said he wanted to respect the private conversations of a former colleague of his.
Yeah, there are two things I love about that story. One, the idea that these guys so trust each other that one of them took exquisite notes about this conversation they had. And the other being Walker, I tell you what, you go ahead, you run for that House seat. I'll let you do that. And I'll just run for this little old United States Senate seat over here. And almost like he's doing Bud a favor. Obviously, I wasn't in the meeting, don't know the tone, but that is kind of hilarious to me, this idea of almost like you're doing somebody a favor by running for the U.S. Senate. There is no love lost pretty much anywhere in this race. I mean, I don't think anybody dislikes Marjorie Eastman, but other than that, like, there are people who hate McCrory, there are people who hate Mark Walker. I think there are a lot of people who look at Bud and just like, yeah, it's Ted Bud. But I was a little surprised how wide the gulf seemed to be between Bud and Walker particularly.
And let's be clear, tensions between candidates is not an unusual thing in a primary. Revealing of these private conversations and airing them out in public, that's a little bit unusual to me. And one thing that I found interesting talking with Walker as well is he said he met with Trump in Mar-a-Lago, where he was seated next to Club for Growth Action President David McIntosh, and Donald Trump was there. And they had both tried to, as Walker puts it, push him out of the Senate race to make room for Bud, and he would run for Congress. Obviously, Walker did not do that, especially because these congressional maps were still working their way through the court system. So he thought it wise not to make that move until we had a finalized map. And so ultimately, he decided to stay in the US Senate race. There wasn't really a viable home for him in the newly enacted congressional map. And this speaks to some of the tension as well, where you're having Bud's backers trying to push Walker out of this race. And if you ask Bud, he still considers himself the favorite in that Trump lane. His own polling has McCrory as a slim front runner. So it's just an interesting race. And McCrory is really trying to campaign as, I'm the one to return us to this Reagan era style of politics of cordiality. And that's what he's campaigning on. And Marjorie K. Eastman is campaigning on, we have two choices really, politicians and me. So she's trying to brand herself as the outsider, and you need 30% to win the primary. So even if Eastman doesn't have much of a chance of winning, she could still affect this race.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Club for Growth. What is it they've promised to put in for Bud? $10 million, something like that?
Yeah, they initially said we're going to make a $10 million spend on Bud to boost him throughout the primary cycle. They've already spent $4 million as of a few months ago. And they just said, we're going to spend an additional $10 million between now and the May 17th primary, which boosts that spending from 10 million total to 14 million total. And that can also be a sign of hardship for Bud getting his messaging out. They say that if we inform voters of the Trump endorsement and then get to talking about Bud's policies, that the voters like him. But a challenge has been the Supreme Court in North Carolina pushed the election back by 10 weeks. And as the Club for Growth president put it to me, the group and Bud's campaign went dark during this period of really a couple months. And that's what has stalled their momentum a little bit.
Well, I mean, if you've only got $10 to $14 million to spend, Brian, you can't just be spending it all the time. I mean, come on.
Well, we were talking earlier, Travis, we had a meeting and I thought we had come to an understanding that I would get $14 million to be on this show, but I guess that's not the case.
Now our budget is significantly lower. Two things. One, the election is not as far away as people may think. Absentee ballots will start going out in the mail next week. So, and then I believe I'd have to look it up again, but I think early voting starts April 28th. Early in-person voting, so a month from now, give or take. I also want to mention that some other spending other than Club for Growth, the Conservative Outsiders PAC, and I can't remember the guy's name who's funding this. It begins with a U. Maybe you remember it. But they did a $1 million buy against McCrory. So there's a new ad that you'll see from COPAC, Conservative Outsiders PAC, that'll be running in North Carolina, hitting McCrory.
I would know. Is that Richard Whalen? Maybe, perhaps. I know he was the biggest donor of Club for Growth, and it's worth noting he is sort of the co-founder of this large packing company based in Atlanta. He's a wealthy man, and much of Club for Growth's money has come from billionaires. And Richard Whalen, he is the biggest donor to Club for Growth, so he's playing an outsized role in North Carolina politics for sure.
Yeah, I don't think that I can't remember. So I shouldn't have set something up that I don't remember. I do remember. How's that for a segue? That Donald Trump is coming to our area. He'll be in Johnston County April 9th.
Yep, Saturday the 9th.
Saturday, April 9th, about 5 weeks before the election. It's of course he'll be talking about Ted Budd, but it's right in Bo Hines' neck of the woods. Bo Hines, young man running for Congress in the 13th congressional district. I believe there are 8 Republicans in that race. I would think this would be a big boost for Hines.
Yeah, I would say that Hines is he's got the Trump endorsement. Bud has the Trump endorsement, and in Trump's news release announcing this April 9th event, he had said that he's going to sort of tout his endorsements in the race. To which I said, what are the multiple congressional endorsements? I'm only aware of one so far. So stay tuned between now and April 9th, I guess, as we could see Trump even be more active in these primaries potentially.
Well, and if you can just imagine the conga line of people trying to get in his ear or in his people's ear between now and when he takes the stage April 9th, good luck to the people who have to manage that process, because people will be crawling all over each other. Real quickly, I want to mention the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings. I knew I was going to trip over that name. To put her on the United States Supreme Court. Just quickly, I'll mention that Senator Tom Tillis is on the Judiciary Committee, so of course he took part in the Judiciary Committee's hearings, questioning Judge Jackson. Tillis spent a lot of his time decrying the potential end for the filibuster. He had a lot of kind words for the judge, although I saw Politico said he's probably not a yes vote, probably not one of the few Republicans who might cross the line here and vote for. They even went so far as to publish a piece specifically explaining why they didn't include Tillis in that group, including that he voted against her when she was confirmed to the DC Court of Appeals, which was just a year. I mean, it was less than a year ago that she moved up to the Court of Appeals. Our other Senator, Richard Burr, he was mentioned as a potential Republican vote to confirm by Politico. He's meeting with her next week. He said, told Politico he didn't watch any of the confirmation hearings due to his day job, which I thought was United States Senator. I don't know why.
Retiring United States Senator. He's in the process of retiring.
But I mean, worth noting, Burr also voted against her to the DC Circuit last year. I don't know what would change in less than a year there. But obviously that very, very big national story, as everything else does, has a North Carolina angle. Voter ID, that was back before the Supreme Court. Our voter ID law, the law itself wasn't before the Supreme Court, but on Monday, the
U.S. Supreme Court too, right, Travis?
That U.S. Supreme Court, I mean, yes. It wasn't the law, it was who will defend the law in court as a a 2-year-old federal lawsuit gets geared up back here in North Carolina. The Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, will have to decide whether or not to let Phil Berger and Tim Moore, our Republican leadership in the General Assembly, kind of take a leading role in that defense, or whether Attorney General Josh Stein, worth noting a Democrat, will continue to handle it as the normal attorney representing the State Board of Elections in this. Republicans feel like Stein has not given a vigorous enough defense although he's been successful defending the law so far in this case, and no real evidence has been presented other than kind of he's a Democrat and we don't trust him, which not the first time we've heard something like that.
And I will point out on the note of the Supreme Court, this is the first Black woman to be onto the U.S. Supreme Court if she's appointed. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin signaled today, we're recording on a Friday, that he would support her. So that seems to clinch the nomination in some ways. So just want to take a moment to note, this is a historic moment as well, and we can get lost in the day-to-day drama, but this is certainly something that is noticeable and going to have an impact for future generations.
That's right. Absolutely. I'll mention very briefly the case we've talked about a little bit, trying to keep Madison Cawthorn off the ballot here in North Carolina, have him labeled as an insurrectionist for his role in the January 6th attacks on the Capitol, and basically say, hey, the 14th Amendment bars insurrectionists from being members of Congress, and you can't run. That's a state level challenge. There is a federal level challenge that Cawthorn himself filed to try to block the state from doing that. And I tell you all that to tell you this, Cawthorn's legal team filed with the court today, Friday, asking for attorney fees because it's won so far at the federal level in this, not over, but it's won so far, $147,000. That case,
those are some great attorneys in a very short period of time.
That case is less than 2 months old. Yeah. And so we talk about justice and the access to justice in this country. That is a lot of money that it takes to, I think in Cawthorn's words, to protect your First Amendment rights, your right to be on the ballot here. That's all I've got for this week. I got a couple of things I'll mention that are happening next week. Brian, you got anything else looking back?
I just note that I'll pin to my Twitter account that U.S. Senate story. I think it's a good overview of the state of the race, and my handle's just Brian R. Anderson, Brian with a Y.
Yeah, Brian had interviews with all 4 major candidates in that race, and so go check it out. Very quickly, next week, Tuesday, the Medicaid Expansion Committee at the General Assembly meets. Check my text messages. Do I know what that meeting is about? I do not. But that is a committee that has been looking at whether or not we might expand Medicaid in North Carolina. They've been doing various things, have been meeting for several weeks now. Don't know exactly what they're going to talk about, but generally healthcare. And as I noted earlier, absentee ballots. Check your mailbox. If you've requested one, as soon as next week, you might be seeing it in your mail, probably along with some campaign flyers. So 'tis the season.
Yep, beware of your mailbox. It's going to be flooded.
Yep. All right. I think that's enough for us. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend if you're listening to this on the weekend. And check us back next week. We'll get you caught up here on The Wrap.